Goodbye.
Don't go.
Amelia Hart understood from the moment Duke Nathaniel Ashford looked up from the contract and added one final condition in that cold, even voice of his that she was not walking into a marriage at all. She was walking into a countdown. The solicitor had already read the essential terms aloud. Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Ashford, required a wife for exactly 1 year in order to satisfy the last condition of his grandfather's will and retain full control of the Ashford estates. Amelia Hart, daughter of a deceased country gentleman who had left behind more debts than dignity, would receive enough money to save her family home, pay her father's creditors, and keep her younger sister in school. In return, she would become the Duchess of Ashford in name, accompany Nathaniel to the social events expected of a wife, and remain at Ashford Manor until the contract expired. It was humiliating. Was mercenary. It was the only way Amelia could think of to keep her family from being ruined. So when the solicitor finished speaking, she steadied her hand, reached for the pen, and prepared to sign. That was when Nathaniel interrupted. There is one more clause. Your Grace. He was seated across from Amelia at the long mahogany table, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other lightly touching the unsigned contract. He looked as he always did in society sketches, impossibly composed, dark-haired, elegant, and so controlled that it was difficult to imagine him ever having been a boy at all. Nothing in his face suggested hesitation. Nothing suggested shame. He did not even glance at Amelia when he spoke. When the year ends, neither party may request that the marriage continue. I beg your pardon. No discussions once the term is complete. When the year ends, Mrs. Hart will leave Ashford Manor, and neither of us will ask the other to stay. The clause itself should not have surprised her. She had never been foolish enough to imagine this arrangement would turn into anything permanent. Nathaniel Ashford had not chosen her because he wanted a wife. He had chosen her because she was available, respectable enough to survive a year in society, and desperate enough to accept his terms. And yet, hearing him say it aloud so precisely, so publicly, made the arrangement feel harsher than it had only moments before. As though he feared she might one day beg for something more. As though he wanted to make certain she understood from the beginning exactly how little he intended to give. The solicitor looked uncomfortable now. Your Grace, perhaps that is not strictly necessary. His eyes were a striking, severe shade of blue, and there was nothing cruel in them, which somehow made the cruelty of his words worse. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a man settling a practical matter that should never have required emotion in the first place. I am offering you my name, my protection, and enough money to rescue your family from your father's mistakes, he said. Please do not ask me for anything more. She thought of her father, dead only 6 months, leaving behind unpaid debts and a house already slipping from their grasp. She thought of her 17-year-old sister, Lucy, who still believed Amelia could somehow keep their world from collapsing if only she smiled often enough and wrote enough reassuring letters. She thought of the servants who had worked for the Hart family for years and would soon lose their places if the house were sold. And she thought of the man sitting across from her, speaking of marriage as though it were a legal inconvenience he intended to survive with as little human involvement as possible. Amelia should have refused. She should have stood up, wished his Grace joy of his contract, and walked out with whatever pride she had left. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the page and signed her name, because pride could not pay creditors. Pride could not keep a roof over Lucy's head. Pride, she had learned, was a luxury for people whose families were not drowning. The wedding took place 3 days later in a private chapel on Ashford land, witnessed by the solicitor, 2 servants, Lucy, and Nathaniel's mother, who looked at Amelia with the restrained disappointment of a woman who had once expected a grander daughter-in-law for her only son. There were no flowers beyond those already standing near the altar, no orchestra, no celebration afterward. By noon, Amelia Hart had become the Duchess of Ashford, and by evening she was seated inside the Duke's carriage on her way to a house so large and ancient that it felt less like a home than the inheritance of a dead empire. Ashford Manor rose from the countryside in pale stone and winter ivy, magnificent enough to make Amelia forget her own exhaustion for a moment. Its windows caught the late sunlight. Its towers overlooked miles of land. Its sweeping drive was lined with bare trees and statues whose faces had weathered into solemn indifference. Everything about it spoke of permanence, wealth, and generations of power. Everything except the silence. It was not the silence of an empty house. Servants moved everywhere. Footmen carried trunks. Maids hurried through corridors. The housekeeper supervised her staff with military precision. Yet the atmosphere itself felt muted, as though laughter had been discouraged there. For so long that the walls no longer remembered what it sounded like. Amelia understood why before the end of her first week. Nathaniel was not a cruel man. That, strangely enough, was the problem. If he had been arrogant, quick-tempered, or carelessly dismissive, the household's discomfort would have been easier to explain. But Nathaniel did not shout. He did not humiliate servants. He did not use his rank like a weapon. He was always polite, always controlled, and almost always absent, disappearing into estate business before breakfast and returning from his study only when duty required it. And yet the entire house seemed to tighten when he entered a room. Servants lowered their eyes. Guests measured their words. Even his own mother watched him with the caution of someone approaching a man who had forgotten how to be approached. No one contradicted him. No one teased him. No one, Amelia slowly realized, behaved as though the Duke of Ashford were an ordinary human being who might occasionally enjoy a conversation not built entirely from caution and approval. At first, she assumed Nathaniel knew and preferred it that way. Later, she began to suspect something worse. He had grown so accustomed to being treated like a title that he no longer noticed the loneliness of it. A small dinner had been arranged at Ashford Manor for 2 neighbouring landowners and a member of Parliament who hoped to secure Nathaniel's support for some upcoming agricultural reform. Amelia spent most of the evening listening because the men at the table clearly considered themselves engaged in a matter of national importance, and because Nathaniel, when discussing estate business, spoke with the same cool precision he used for everything else. He was intelligent. More than intelligent, in fact. He was one of those rare men whose mind seemed to sort problems before other people had fully understood them. Amelia could see why people admired him. She could also see why no one around him ever said what they truly thought. The moment Nathaniel expressed an opinion, the rest of the table rushed to agree. A tenant matter was handled exactly as he suggested. Of course it was. A trade agreement would surely succeed because His Grace had approved it. Naturally. Then near the end of dinner, the conversation shifted from politics to literature, and Nathaniel casually remarked that a celebrated French novelist was vastly overrated. Within seconds, every guest at the table agreed with astonishing enthusiasm. Amelia nearly laughed aloud. She had heard one of those same men praising the novelist less than an hour earlier in the drawing room. Nathaniel noticed the expression on her face at once. What is it? Only that I had not realized literary opinions could change so quickly. Nathaniel's mother closed her eyes for the briefest second, as though praying for patience. Nathaniel regarded Amelia steadily. You disagree? Amelia could feel the weight of every gaze at the table, but now that the words were out, there seemed little point in retreating. I also think at least half this table agreed with you before considering whether they actually meant to. And yet the only person who looked truly surprised was Nathaniel. The others looked horrified. For one stretched moment, Amelia wondered whether she had gone too far. Whether she had just humiliated her husband in front of his own guests less than a week into the marriage and would spend the night regretting. Then something changed in Nathaniel's face. It was small, barely visible, but unmistakable. He was amused. The expression vanished almost at once, replaced by his usual reserve, but Amelia had seen it. And judging by the startled silence around the table, so had everyone else. The conversation moved on, though somewhat awkwardly after that, and the evening ended without disaster. Yet later, as Amelia climbed the staircase to her room, Nathaniel's voice stopped her. You made my guests very uncomfortable. They seemed uncomfortable already, she replied, because they were trying not to offend me. Most people would have found it wiser to remain silent. Are you not? Though I do think you have become far too accustomed to being agreed with. It was a bold thing to say to a man who could dismiss her from his life in 11 months and 3 weeks. Nathaniel should have been offended. Instead, to Amelia's astonishment, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Not quite. But something dangerously close. Good night, Duchess, he said and disappeared into the library before she could think of an answer. Nathaniel remained distant, still vanishing into work for hours at a time, still treating their marriage as an arrangement rather than a relationship, but he had begun looking at her differently. As though she had become unexpectedly difficult to categorize. Their conversations grew more frequent, never romantic, rarely personal, but real. If Nathaniel returned from London in a foul mood, Amelia would ask which politician had insulted his intelligence this time. If he criticized a book, she would tell him precisely why he was wrong. If he spoke too harshly to a steward or dismissed a concern too quickly, she would quietly say so afterward. And to her astonishment, he listened. Not always graciously, not always immediately, but he listened. That, more than anything, made her uneasy. Because it would have been easier if Nathaniel Ashford had remained only what he had been on the day of the contract, a handsome, distant man with too much money and no intention of ever caring for the woman he married. It would have been easier if he were arrogant, careless, or selfish in obvious ways. Instead, Amelia was beginning to discover the far more dangerous truth. Nathaniel was lonely, intelligent, and far too unused to being treated like a man. And she was beginning to like him. That alone was enough to frighten her. Then came the house party. It was the first large gathering Ashford Manor had hosted since the wedding, and by the second evening, Amelia understood exactly what society thought of her. Women smiled too sweetly. Men spoke to her with that particular kind of politeness reserved for people whose motives are already being judged. She heard enough whispered remarks to know the story had spread precisely as expected. The new Duchess had married for money, and the Duke, being too practical for romance, had bought himself a temporary wife. Nathaniel heard the whispers too. Of that, Amelia was certain. Yet he said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not deny the rumors. He simply moved through the evening with the same composed indifference he wore like armor, as though gossip were beneath his notice and therefore beneath hers as well. Amelia told herself she did not care. Then after dinner, one of the guests made the mistake of asking Nathaniel whether he was enjoying married life. The question was meant as a joke. Everyone in the drawing room knew it. Nathaniel, standing near the fireplace with a glass in one hand, answered without even glancing toward Amelia. This arrangement was never meant to become permanent. No one needed the sentence explained. It was not merely a response to an impertinent question. It was a reminder delivered before half the county that the Duchess of Ashford was temporary. That whatever she wore, wherever she sat, however graciously she played the part, she would be gone when the contract ended. Amelia kept her face perfectly calm. She even smiled when one of the older ladies asked about the music. She remained in the drawing room until the last guest retired. Only when the corridors had emptied and the house had gone dark did she allow herself to retreat to the small morning room beside her bedchamber, the one place in Ashford Manor that felt remotely her own. She did not hear Nathaniel's footsteps outside the half-open door. She thought she was alone. "I knew I would have to leave," she whispered, pressing a hand against the ache in her chest. "I only did not expect it to hurt this soon." A moment of weakness she would despise in herself by morning, and because she did not know Nathaniel was standing motionless in the corridor beyond the light, she never saw the expression that crossed his face when he heard them. It was not pity. It was not guilt, not yet. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either. For the first time since signing the contract, Nathaniel Ashford realized that Amelia had not merely accepted his cruel terms. She had been wounded by them. And for reasons he did not yet understand, the knowledge followed him long after he turned away from her door and disappeared into the dark. After the night Nathaniel declared before his guests that their marriage had never been meant to last, something in Amelia quietly withdrew. To anyone else, the change might have seemed small. She still performed every duty expected of the Duchess of Ashford with grace. She still sat across from him at dinner, still accompanied him when society required it, still spoke with perfect courtesy whenever he addressed her. But the warmth had gone out of her. Amelia no longer argued with him over books, no longer laughed when he became too severe, no longer treated Ashford Manor as though it might someday feel like home. She was polite now, distant, careful in a way she had never been before. And Nathaniel hated it more than he cared to admit. The silence between them settled over the house almost at once. Meals became shorter. Evenings grew colder. For the first time since their marriage began, Nathaniel understood how much of Ashford Manor's warmth had belonged not to the house itself, but to the woman who had once filled it with dry wit, stubborn honesty, and a complete refusal to be impressed by him. Without Amelia's teasing voice across the dinner table or her steady habit of speaking to him like an ordinary man, the manor felt as lifeless as it had before she entered it. At first, he tried to ignore it. He buried himself in estate business, spent longer hours in his study, and told himself that this distance was only the natural consequence of his own honesty. He had warned Amelia from the beginning that the marriage would end. If she had finally accepted that truth, he had no right to resent it. Yet the more carefully she withdrew from him, the more sharply Nathaniel felt her absence. He found himself glancing toward the morning room and expecting to see her there with a book in hand. He caught himself saving remarks at dinner only to remember too late that Amelia no longer offered him the kind of conversation that once made the evenings bearable. Even his victories in business seemed strangely hollow when there was no one at Ashford willing to tell him he was being insufferable about them. The realization that unsettled him most arrived one afternoon while searching through his grandfather's old papers. Hidden among a stack of estate letters was a note in Henry Ashford's hand mentioning Amelia by name. Nathaniel read it twice before the meaning fully settled over him. His grandfather had known Amelia long before arranging the contract marriage. More than that, he had admired her. In a single line that refused to leave Nathaniel's mind, Henry had written that Amelia was one of the very few people who saw his grandson as a man before she saw a duke. Nathaniel folded the letter slowly. It was true. That was the part he could not escape. Amelia had never flattered him, never feared him, never adjusted herself to his title the way everyone else did. She argued with him when he was wrong, mocked him when he was arrogant, and looked at him with a kind of calm honesty that no one else in his life had ever dared offer. And now that she had withdrawn it, Nathaniel realized with growing unease how much he had come to rely on it. He tried awkwardly to bridge the distance. One afternoon, he found Amelia in the conservatory arranging flowers and told her, more bluntly than gracefully, that she had been avoiding him. Amelia only looked at him with that quiet composure he was beginning to despise, and said that she was merely respecting the boundaries set. When he admitted that his words at the house party had been unkind, she did not accuse him, did not cry, did not even seem surprised. She simply answered that unkindness was easier to bear when one had been warned in advance. The calmness of it made him feel worse than anger would have. From that moment on, Nathaniel stopped lying to himself about the true problem. He did not merely miss Amelia's conversation. He missed Amelia herself. He missed the way she challenged him, the way she seemed unimpressed by his title, the way she could look directly at him and somehow make him feel less like a monument and more like a man. And the more he recognized that truth, the more dangerous the approaching end of the contract felt. Then Daniel Mercer arrived. He was an old family acquaintance of Amelia's, a gentleman passing through the county who called at Ashford Manor to inquire about Lucy. There was nothing improper about the visit, Nathaniel knew that. Mercer was polite, well-bred, and clearly harmless. But when Nathaniel entered the library and found Amelia smiling at another man with an ease she no longer offered him, something dark and immediate tightened in his chest. He stood through the conversation with perfect courtesy and spent the rest of the afternoon in such a foul temper that even the servants noticed. It was only later, alone in his study, that he admitted the humiliating truth. He was jealous. Jealous of a man who had no claim on Amelia at all. Jealous because, for the first time in years, Nathaniel could imagine a future in which Amelia laughed with someone else, spoke freely with someone else, built a life beyond Ashford Manor with someone who had not been foolish enough to drive her away. The thought left him cold. That should have been the moment he ended the charade, tore up the contract, and asked her to stay. Instead, pride did what it had always done best. It kept him silent. As the final days of the contract approached, Nathaniel found himself watching Amelia with growing desperation. She had begun packing. Books disappeared from the morning room. Dresses were folded into trunks. The little traces of her presence that had slowly transformed Ashford Manor into something livable were vanishing one by one, and still Nathaniel could not force himself to say the words that mattered. More than once he went to her door intending to stop her. More than once he imagined telling her everything, that the house would feel unbearable without her, that his grandfather had been right, that somewhere between winter and spring he had fallen hopelessly in love with the one woman he had sworn never to need. But each time, fear and pride silenced him before he spoke. Then the final morning came. Amelia left before sunrise, taking only what belonged to her and the dignity he had given her. Far too little reason to keep. By the time Nathaniel reached her rooms, the fire had gone cold, the bed was neatly made. And the house already felt emptier than he had thought possible. On the table beside the window lay only two things, her wedding ring and a single folded note. Nathaniel opened it with unsteady hands. You kept your promise, Your Grace. I will keep mine. Then, for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Ashford understood what it meant to realize the truth too late. He had not merely lost a wife he was never meant to keep, he had lost the only woman who had ever made him feel human. Amelia left Ashford Manor before dawn, believing that the hardest part of the marriage was finally over. She was wrong. 2 weeks after arriving in the quiet coastal town where Lucy was staying, Amelia began to feel unwell. At first, she blamed exhaustion. The final days at Ashford had been painful enough, and the journey itself had left her drained. But when the dizziness turned to nausea and the exhaustion refused to fade, Lucy insisted on sending for a physician. The truth changed everything. Amelia was carrying Nathaniel's child. For several long moments, she could only sit there in silence, one hand pressed against the arm of the chair as the physician's words settled over her. A child, Nathaniel's child. A part of him she would carry long after the contract had ended, and his name was no longer hers to claim. Her first feeling was not fear but heartbreak because the news should have been something joyful, something shared, and instead it arrived in the small sitting room of a rented seaside cottage with no husband beside her and no certainty about what future she could possibly offer their child. She told no one but Lucy. Not Nathaniel. Not yet. He had not asked her to stay. And Amelia could not bear the thought of appearing before him with this news only to discover that duty, not love, would be the thing that brought him back. If Nathaniel ever stood before her again, she wanted it to be because he chose her. Not because honor forced his hand. At Ashford Manor, Nathaniel lasted only a handful of days before admitting what pride had kept him from saying aloud, he loved her. The truth was waiting for him in every room Amelia had left behind. In the silence of the breakfast table. In the untouched books she had once argued with him about. In the empty morning room where he had grown used to finding her before bed. Ashford Manor had everything it had possessed before Amelia entered it: wealth, order, power, perfect control, and for the first time in his life Nathaniel understood how little any of it meant when the one person who had made the house feel alive was gone. His mother watched him pace the drawing room in growing misery and finally said with the calm bluntness only Lady Eleanor Ashford could manage, if you mean to spend the rest of your life regretting this, then by all means remain where you are. But if you mean to fix it, stop punishing the carpet and go find your wife. Nathaniel's search led him first to Lucy, who greeted him with open suspicion and very little sympathy. You do not deserve to know where she is, she said, standing between him and the parlor door as though she fully intended to defend Amelia from a duke twice her size if necessary. My sister spent a year learning how not to need you. I know what I deserve, he said. I'm not asking for fairness. I'm asking for the chance to tell her I was wrong. Lucy studied him for a long moment and whatever she saw in his face must have softened her just enough to speak the truth that changed everything. Amelia is pregnant. The room, the fire, Lucy herself seemed to fall away for one disorienting second as the word struck him with the force of a blow. Amelia had left Ashford carrying his child, and while he had been drowning in his own regret, she had been facing that truth alone. When did she find out? He asked, his voice unsteady. A few days ago. And she had not sent for him, had not written, had not asked anything of him at all. The shame of that nearly crushed him. Lucy gave him the address of the cottage only after extracting a promise that if he hurt Amelia again, she would never forgive him. Nathaniel told her with complete honesty that he would not forgive himself either. The cottage stood near the sea, small and whitewashed, with blue shutters and a narrow path leading down toward the shore. Nathaniel arrived in the late afternoon, windblown and exhausted from the journey, and for a moment he simply stood before the door, trying to steady the panic in his chest. Amelia opened it herself. She looked paler than when he had last seen her, and there was a new softness to her expression that made his heart ache with immediate tenderness. One hand rested almost unconsciously over her stomach, as though some part of her had already begun protecting the life inside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Amelia said quietly, "You found me." Nathaniel stepped inside only when she moved aside, and even then, he stopped just beyond the doorway, as though he had not yet earned the right to come any farther. "Lucy told me," he said, his eyes dropping briefly to the hand she kept over their child. "You should never have had to face that alone." So Nathaniel did the only thing left to do. He told her the truth. All of it. He told her that he had written the cruel clause into the contract because he had been afraid of exactly this, of needing someone enough to be hurt by losing them. He told her that every wall he had built around himself had felt sensible until the day she walked out of Ashford and took the warmth of the house with her. He told her that he had mistaken pride for strength and distance for safety, and that by the time he understood what Amelia meant to him, he had already made himself the man who sent away the woman he loved. "I gave you every reason to leave," he said, his voice rough with remorse, "and then I hated myself the moment you did. I thought I could keep this marriage temporary and protect myself from needing anyone. Instead, I lost my wife and nearly lost the chance to know my own child before it was even born. You humiliated me," she said softly, "from the very beginning. You made certain I understood I would never truly belong beside you. I know. I came because I love you. The child is a blessing I do not deserve, but even if there were no child at all, I would still be standing here asking for another chance." Silence filled the little cottage. Outside, the sea crashed softly against the rocks below. At last, Amelia turned away, pressing a hand to her eyes before facing him again. When she spoke, her voice trembled. But it was the first crack in the wall between them. Nathaniel remained in the village for the next several weeks, renting the neighboring cottage. And giving Amelia exactly what he had never given her before: patience, honesty, and time. He did not demand that she return with him. He did not use the baby as an excuse to force his way back into her life. He simply stayed. He walked her to the physician when she was tired, brought Lucy books when she complained of boredom, and spoke to Amelia. Not as a duke bargaining for what he wanted, but as a man who finally understood how much he had already lost. Slowly, painfully, Amelia began to believe him. When Nathaniel asked her to marry him again, it was months later on a windy cliff above the sea, with the sky turning gold behind them and the future of their small family growing quietly between them. "There will be no contract this time," he said, taking both her hands in his. "No conditions. No deadline. No promise that asks you to leave. Only me, if you can still bear to have me, and every day I have left to prove that I was wrong." Their child was born that winter, and when Amelia finally returned to Ashford Manor, it was no longer as a temporary duchess counting down the days until she had to leave. She returned as Nathaniel's wife in truth, carrying the child they had nearly lost the chance to raise together, and the hard-earned certainty that this time he had chosen her without conditions. Nathaniel would spend the rest of his life grateful that she had given him a second chance to do so. What he should have done from the very beginning: love her openly, keep her honestly, and never again confuse fear with strength.